So I've been seeing a lot of fake news claims floating around lately regarding crime rates in the United States and Canada. So I wanted to clear the air on some things because there's a lot of right wingers who keep saying that America is having this crime epidemic right now, but it's only in blue states, or at least in blue cities or blue counties. Whereas you have left wingers countering that by saying, no, it's actually red states where this is happening. Although with them a bit less so, it tends to be the right that freaks out more about crime in a general sense. Although some leftists do, but they freak out more specifically about alleged hate crimes and about any sort of like sexual crimes against, mostly sexual crimes against women. Um, Occasionally sexual crimes against men, but I don't think they care about that nearly as much. But yeah, when looking at the actual data, the picture is actually very complicated because when asking which states have worse crime rates, red states or blue states, it's actually not clear because it really depends what type of crime you're focusing on. Like, for instance, when it comes to, I'm going to look at the different crimes one by one. And just for the record, okay, I got my data from Wikipedia. However, it links to an FBI spreadsheet. Like, I looked it up on the actual spreadsheet. The problem is that the spreadsheet doesn't show per capita rates. So I put it into Excel just to corroborate it. And it looks like, well, I didn't even check the Wikipedia ones, but I checked the ones that weren't on Wikipedia. And I cross-referenced it with some stats from Statista because Statista is a source that is like not always reliable, but it turned out that the stats were accurate from Statista. So yeah, I can link to all these in the description to show what exactly I'm talking about. Also, for stats on on specific cities and towns, the website city-data.com has detailed crime stats on like almost every municipality in the United States. For Canada, I actually got the data from the Government of Canada website. But yeah. So yeah, that's where I got the data from. So it's all either from government sources or cross-referenced with government sources and turned out to be accurate. So yeah, well, except the Wikipedia data. I didn't check that, but honestly, Wikipedia is usually pretty good for these things. Like, I find they're better than a lot of sources. But yeah, I mean, I do have the source to where the data is from. And yeah. So for homicide, red states are actually worse. And that's something that a lot of right wingers are dead wrong on because they talk about how it's like blue states that are having this like murder epidemic right now, but it's actually red states on average that have worse homicide rates. They have for a long time and they still do now. That being said, there are some blue states that have seen worse increases, particularly in specific cities. Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, New York City have all seen significant increases in homicides lately, as have Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. But nonetheless, a lot of the worst cities for homicide are in red states like New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis. And again, it's not all cities either. There's a lot of red states, like you have like the Black Belt in the southern states, which is predominantly composed of rural areas. And also some heavily Hispanic areas in Texas. Not to mention some of the meth head areas or fentanyl addict or whatever in eastern Kentucky, western West Virginia, which probably have like the worst white homicide rates in the United States. Aside from possibly Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, where you have a lot of drug addicts of various racial backgrounds. So yeah, homicide tends to be worse in red states actually. Now Can I say the R word on YouTube? Am I going to get flagged by this? Fuck it. I'm going to say it. Rape. Rape statistics are semi unreliable because in the mid 2010s, the FBI completely changed the definition of rape to a more feminist definition. And in my opinion, many of these cases that are being counted as rape right now are just not actually rape. But if you're going to look at the statistics, like you could argue that even if the statistics are exaggerated because they include things that shouldn't actually be defined as rape, that nonetheless they might be accurate in terms of like if the proportion of actual rape to bullshit rape is the same in every state, then the statistics would still show which states are worse. But we don't know if that proportion, that ratio is the same in every state, because maybe there's some states where there are more instances of people being charged with things that aren't really rape and being labeled as rape. But regardless, okay. If we're going to look at the rape statistics, red states are far worse, and it's not even close. There is a huge pattern here where red states have the highest rates of rape. It's not even a weak correlation, it's a strong one. It's stronger than with homicide. It's a very strong correlation where red states tend to have the worst rape rates and blue states tend to have the lowest ones. Now obviously there's exceptions, but yeah, by and large it's red states. So there you go. Take that for what it's worth, because again, like, I mean, I think their definition is partially illegitimate, but nonetheless, I mean, are these statistics totally worthless? I don't know. So robbery. Now, robbery is like mugging, basically. Robbery is when you steal something from someone else using either violent force or the threat of violent force. So if you hold someone at gunpoint and take their wallet, that is robbery. Whereas if somebody leaves their wallet lying around and you steal it, that is theft. Or if you pickpocket someone, that is theft. However, if you pickpocket someone, they catch you doing it, and then you get in a fight with them over the wallet, then it becomes robbery. So similarly, burglary is when you go into somebody's house to steal something, like you break into their house. However, if you break in their house and then you also threaten them at gunpoint, then that is both burglary and robbery. I think. I am not entirely sure on the definition, but that is how I gather it. Robbery is stealing something by force. Theft is stealing something without force. And burglary is breaking into a home or building to steal stuff. Now, I think if you break into a car, that is actually still considered theft and not burglary in the United States. Again, like, I am not 100% sure on these distinctions, but that is how I gather the distinction between robbery, theft, and burglary. Okay. For robbery, which is mugging, like threat of physical force or actual physical force, this is an area where the right wing is actually correct. This is a fucking blue state problem. This is, by and large, hugely a blue state problem. Blue states are a lot worse for robbery. Not only that, but I will admit it, the worst cities tend to be walkable cities. The worst cities tend to be, like, frankly, the kinds of places I like to go to. Like, places with a lot of historic architecture that are dense and walkable. Although some cities that are less historic but still dense and walkable are also high for this, like Seattle and Portland. But yes, blue states tend to be the worst for robbery. Now, to be fair, in their defense, I think part of the reason is just there's more people on the streets. Like, people generally tend to get robbed. Like, the most common occurrence, according to the FBI statistics, is on streets or highways, as they define it. So people basically walking around. And the fact is, there's a lot more people walking around in walkable cities. So that means there's more people to mug in a city where there's more people walking around. So does it mean even if per capita more people are robbed, like, to be fair, like, even in places with lower robbery rates, if it's simply because there are fewer people on the streets, does that mean if you're the one person on the streets, will you get robbed? I don't know, because there are some places that have high robbery rates that don't have a lot of people walking around. Like, I mean, like East St. Louis, I don't think a lot of people walk around there, but yet the robbery rate is still pretty high. So I don't know. I mean, maybe this is an area where walkable cities tend to be worse, and where places with left leaning policies seem to be worse. I'd be very curious to see the robbery rates in Europe, but unfortunately, I've never been able to find those statistics except really, really old ones for the UK. Well, like over 10 years old, which actually do have England as being worse than the United States per capita, although not Scotland. Scotland is actually far lower per capita. But again, that's really old statistics. But yeah, nonetheless, okay, robbery, yep, fair enough, is largely a blue state problem, with blue states being at the top of the list, and especially ones with big walkable cities, especially those cities themselves. Like, I've looked up the data on city-data.com, and yes, it is those cities that often do have the worst robbery rates. But not necessarily true for all types of crimes. And yeah, the ones at the bottom of the list for robbery are overwhelmingly red states. So yeah. Aggravated assault. Red states on average tend to be worse for this crime. Now, aggravated assault, to my understanding, is assaulting somebody. Like, what is non-aggravated assault? I don't know. Is it like where you just slap someone kind of lightly? And aggravated assault is when you punch them with a closed fist. I don't know the difference. But aggravated assault actually has far higher numbers than any of the other crimes I've mentioned so far. Robbery, like, it's one of the main violent crimes. Like, homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault are considered violent crimes. And aggravated assault has by far numerically the highest instances of any of these crimes. Now, I would guess a huge portion of aggravated assault is domestic violence. I do remember reading the FBI statistics. There's one source that said robbery is by far the crime, I guess, out of violent crimes, that is most often committed by strangers, whereas homicide is the violent crime that is most often committed by people who you know. So I guess aggravated assault is somewhere in between, and rape would also be somewhere in between. So yeah, aggravated assault, it is predominantly red states that are worse for this crime. So far, for the four main violent crimes, 3 out of 4 red states are worse. That being said, if you divide it at a county level or city level, that changes a lot. Blue counties and cities tend to have worse crime rates in general. I don't know for each individual. Well, I know for cities, definitely, for, I would imagine, pretty much all these crimes. I mean, there aren't many cities that are red, like, in terms of like how they vote in the national elections. And I think there's actually more states that are red in terms of like having a Republican mayor, whereas there are not many cities that are red in terms of how they vote in the federal election. I'm not sure why that is, but I guess that's a thing. So yeah, I mean, saying blue cities have worse crime rates, it's like, yeah, but almost all cities are blue cities, frankly. But from what I've read, yes, on a county level, yes, blue, like, there's a lot of sources I've seen that say yes, blue counties are worse on average. However, I've seen that the worst on average are actually blue counties in red states, which is an interesting dichotomy, because I guess you have blue policies, like Democrat policies, being imposed on a local level, but Republican policies being imposed on a state level. So maybe that combination, for whatever reason, is especially bad in terms of in terms of crime rates. Maybe it's because like things like policing would be more affected on a local level, so you'd get like Democrat style policing and justice through the judicial system. But then on the other hand, when it comes to funding, most of that maybe comes from a state level, so you'd get Republican style funding, and, you know, or lack thereof, lower taxes on the state level. So maybe that's the reason. It's a combination of not having enough money, because that's determined on a state level, with weak ass law enforcement policies, which are determined on a more local level. That would be my guess. I'm completely extrapolating there. I don't know that that's the reason. I'm saying that's my guess. So yeah, other types of crime. Now we're getting into the property crimes. So these are crimes that are not violent in nature, but that involve theft. Now, all theft related crimes are worse in blue states on average. That includes robbery, which is also a violent crime, but also the following property crimes, which are not inherently violent crimes. Burglary. Now, burglary, again, is when you go into someone's house or not car, someone's house or business, and you steal shit. Blue states are slightly worse than red states at the top level, but at the lowest level, the states with the lowest burglary rates that's also dominated by blue states. So red states tend to be more in the middle when it comes to burglary. I'm not sure which is worse overall, but it's close, and like the worst burglary rates are in blue states generally, although not overwhelmingly, but somewhat. Now with larceny is the same as theft, which means you're not breaking and entering, you're not breaking into somebody's well, actually, wait. You're not breaking into somebody's house or business, and you're not using physical force. But you apparently, if you break into someone's car to steal stuff, that is still just considered larceny. And also, like, larceny would be like, let's say, for instance, if somebody leaves something lying around in their front yard and somebody steals it, that's larceny. Or if they're at like a coffee shop and they leave their laptop lying around and they go to the bathroom and then they come back and their laptop is stolen, that is larceny or theft. And by the way, people who do that are really stupid. You should not leave your laptop lying around at a coffee shop when you go to the bathroom. That is not a good idea. Don't do that. Like, honestly, I don't care where you are, unless there's somebody who you actually personally know who is also there who can watch over it, not just some random person, but somebody you actually know. I wouldn't do that ever. But anyway, yeah. Larceny, theft, similar to burglary. Blue states are the worst states for larceny are blue states, but the least bad states also tend to be blue states. However, with larceny, it's even more at the worst level tends to be more blue states, even more so than for burglary. So yeah, blue states. And again, with larceny, burglary, it's a lot of the worst ones are the really woke, like left coast states, like California, Washington and Oregon. Same for robbery, actually, and auto theft, which I'm about to get to. Yeah, for all these theft related offenses, not only blue states, but specifically like the left coast woke blue states, like the really woke ones, do tend to be the worst for these crimes on average. And they're getting worse also over time. Like for instance, some cities in terms of crime rate have gone up, some have gone down, but the ones that seem to be going up the most, like Portland, Oregon, just seems to keep getting worse and worse in almost every category of crime. And yeah, so I'm not sure about San Francisco. I'd have to look that up, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were also. Seattle somewhat, but not quite as much. But Portland is really just keeps getting worse and worse. Minneapolis also is another city that keeps getting worse and worse. Auto theft, it's similar to larceny, so it's like the worst states for auto theft tend to be blue states. A lot of the left coast ones in other blue states. But also the ones that have the lowest rates of auto theft also tend to be blue states. Like when I'm saying like the blue states that are at the bottom of these lists, like the lowest crime rates, they tend to overwhelmingly be ones like New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. They tend to be like near the bottom of like every type of crime per capita, and it's pretty obvious why, because they're the whitest states and they're also like not dirt poor. Like West Virginia is very white, but it's also dirt poor and has a lot of drug addicts. So its crime rates are kind of middle of the road by US standards. Whereas yeah, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont are very low. And again, when red states tend to be at the top of these lists, it often is the states in the South that have a very high black population, and that is often the reason why these states are bad for these crime rates. But at the same time, like, I mean, some of the whiter red states have like middle of the road crime rates for certain types of crimes. So, like, as I said, West Virginia does. I noticed Montana was middle of the road for certain types of property crimes also. So, yeah, I mean, like, there's multiple factors obviously going on here. I also looked at some statistics on gun ownership per capita, and the states that have the lowest gun ownership rates per capita do tend to have the lowest homicide rates also. Um, the highest homicide rates tend to be ones with like higher than average gun ownership, but not the very highest. Like the very highest gun ownership rate by far is Wyoming, and it doesn't have a particularly high homicide rate. I think its homicide rate is like lower than the US average, but not at the very bottom. So, yeah, I mean, there's probably a correlation with more gun ownership and higher homicide rates, but it's not necessarily like the only factor, and it's definitely not the only factor. Like there's obviously other factors like poverty, race, um economic systems. Like there's a lot of other factors going on in regards to like homicide rate. Now with Canada, what's interesting is the highest crime rates across the board in the provinces tend to be actually Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Now the territories I'm not really going to look at. They do have some pretty high crime rates, but they're kind of irrelevant. But yes, theirs tend to be quite high also. But of the main provinces, the worst crime rates are in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. First, like Manitoba, followed by Saskatchewan, followed by Alberta. And those provinces actually have some things in common. Firstly, they do tend to vote conservative more than the other provinces. So our red and blue is reversed. Our blue provinces are conservative. Our red provinces are liberal. It's confusing as fucking hell. Not to mention how red is associated with communism, so that also throws more confusion into the mix regarding the whole political color scheme. But yeah, no, the worst provinces actually tend to be the conservative voting ones. However, another caveat there is that those provinces have the highest rates of Indigenous Canadian population, and they tend to have the highest per capita crime rates of any racial group in Canada, even more so than blacks. Blacks, however, not too many in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but there actually is a growing black population in Alberta at over 4% now. Still not as high as Ontario, but overall, if you add the racial groups in Canada that tend to have the higher crime rates, which is basically Indigenous, blacks, and Latin Americans. We don't have too many Latin Americans in Canada, but those three groups, from what I've seen, like it's hard to get racial statistics in Canada. A lot of this is just guesswork, but it's a very educated guesswork based on like which cities have the higher crime rates and what their demographics are. Plus, they used to have like maps in Toronto of like all the murders and who the victims were and who the perpetrators were. The Toronto Star used to have these maps, and it was like overwhelmingly blacks. Like it was, that's probably why they took them down and discontinued it, because this was something that was very red pilling for me as a kid, like looking up these maps. But yeah, my point is, if you combine these three populations and look at which provinces are highest overall, it is those three provinces, mostly because of the Indigenous Canadian population, but also in Alberta's case, partly because of the black population too. Like, so yeah, there is definitely the racial demographic element, but also there's the fact they do tend to be more conservative voting. So could that be a factor? Maybe, because again, like conservatives do tend to like defund a lot of services geared toward low income people. And it's like, I know a lot of people bitch about paying taxes that go toward low income demographics, but the fact is, there probably is a significant reduced impact on crime rates as a result of this. And the statistics do support that conclusion. And also keep in mind, like Ontario and Quebec do have large like they have the largest black populations in Canada, and we have like poverty as well. Like actually, in fact, I believe, yeah, Alberta and Saskatchewan both have a higher GDP per capita than Ontario or Quebec, and yet they have the higher crime rate. So, yeah, I mean, BC's kind of in the middle. Like, BC has a worse crime rate than Ontario and Quebec, but lower than Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And BC is a mostly liberal voting province. So, yeah, liberal or NDP. That's the thing. Yeah, we also have the NDP making matters more confusing, but you can lump them together with the Liberals in terms of being a left-leaning party. And then in Quebec, you have the Parti Québécois, which makes things even more complicated. I don't know whether to call them a left or right-leaning party. Like, I don't know. But my point is, like, Quebec is seen as a more liberal province. I don't know how accurate that is because they tend to be more, like, more ethnocentric in certain ways. Like they actually banned religious symbols from public employees and it was specifically because of Muslims wearing like hijabs. So I don't know. And that would be something that would be considered unthinkable right now in English Canada. Like, oh, we can't do that. So I don't know. Is Quebec more liberal, more conservative? It's really hard to say. Like they're French. They're of a continental European background. So I feel like their specific political axis kind of exists along different lines than ours. In some ways, I might actually identify with the Québécois right more in some ways because I'm more, economically left of center, but socially definitely quite right wing, very right wing socially. So, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I might identify more with the Québécois right. Because here in English Canada and in the United States, being right wing is very much synonymous with being free market capitalist, which is something that, Trump kind of hinted at changing in his first term and that a lot of the alt-right was trying to change in the 2010s. But now it feels like even Trump and the alt-right have kind of gravitated back into that familiar conservative, economically free market capitalist milieu. They've kind of gone back onto the plantation, so to speak. So yeah, overall, when looking at crime rates, US, it's a big mixed bag between red states and blue states. Red states tend to be worse for crimes that don't involve theft, whereas blue states tend to be worse for crimes that do involve theft. And I mean, overall, crimes that do involve theft are more numerous. However, the most numerous violent crime is aggravated assault, which doesn't involve theft and which is worse in red states. But overall, the most numerous crime of all is larceny, theft, like just basic garden variety theft, and that is worse in blue states. So I guess overall, you probably are more likely to be victimized by crime in a blue state. But the thing is, conservatives harp on so much about high murder rates in blue states when it's actually the red states that are worse in that particular regard. Whereas in Canada, on the other hand, it's actually much more cut and dry. Our conservative voting provinces are the worst across the board for their crime rates, like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta seem to have, they're the worst in almost every type of crime. Like there's no real point in subdividing the different types of crime as I did for the United States, because in Canada, it's just those three provinces just take the cake pretty much across the board. Now, to be honest, I am not sure who the premier of Manitoba is or has been. Like, I know Manitoba does have a lot of NDP voters also. I mean, also, our political system works differently. So we don't have a winner takes all system when it comes to voting in federal elections. Um, so it's determined more on the level of specific ridings, which are like districts. And it's not winner take all by province like it is by state in the United States. But nonetheless, that's what I'm still referring to it on a province level because yes, on a province level, those provinces in federal elections do tend to go predominantly conservative. That being said, yeah, Manitoba is a bit less so because the biggest city, Winnipeg, tends to be overwhelmingly, I think, either liberal or NDP. So it's a little bit more politically mixed. Whereas Saskatchewan and Alberta are much more like flat out conservative voting provinces. And Manitoba does have the worst crime rate of all.